to 686. Maybe you have that memorized. I think I do now, if I'm wrong. 686, again, not in the hymnal proper, but 686 in the confessional portion. And so we are on chapter 30. Still on paragraph 3. We will continue with that today. And we have been really getting into the depths of the elements of worship related to the Lord's Supper. And so we'll continue along those lines this morning. And then just to give you kind of a practical guide from this point. So whatever we don't finish up this morning related to paragraph 3, I do feel that we'll finish that up next Lord's Day. And then the other paragraphs, that would be 4 through 8, some of those will be combined together because those deal with some of the same concepts and or issues. So all of this to say, I believe, and I will not say absolutely, but I believe that we'll finish chapter 30 within 3 or 4 more Lord's Days and we'll be done. And that will actually bring us to the conclusion of the confession altogether. Because if you remember, we jumped ahead and then we came back. So just to give you that progression. Can I have, once more, a volunteer to read paragraph 3, just to remind us where we are? Yes. Sam, thank you.
The Lord Jesus hath, in this ordinance, appointed his ministers to pray and bless the elements of bread and wine, and thereby to set them apart from a common to a holy use. To take and break the bread, to take the cup, and they, communicating also themselves, to give both to the communicants.
Okay, thank you. Let me go ahead and pray too. I meant to pray before I began. Thank you for reading, Sam, but let's go ahead and pray together. Father God, we ask your help this morning. We ask you to help us to consider these matters, these very important matters that we are considering related to the Lord's Supper, that ordinance that you have given us, that ordinance that is a representation of your sacrifice for those that you have called to yourself. Lord, help us to consider these things as we, again, look to the confession, but more importantly, look to your word and think about how these relate to us as we participate as you have called us to do. So we thank you. Guide us and direct us this morning. We do pray in the name of Christ Jesus. Amen. Amen. So yes, we are considering the elements, the bread and wine, as our confession states them. And we have covered a lot of ground up to this point. And we're here considering again that the wine or the cup, what's in the cup is the question that we have been asking most recently. I will not go back at this point to Matthew chapter 26. We have read portions there. Mark chapter 14, we've read portions there. And Luke 22, we've read portions there. All of those, remember that all-important term that the Lord used related to what was in the cup. What was that all-important term? Well, not a singular term, but reference. Fruit of the vine. Okay, so we've talked a lot about the fruit of the vine. Of course, last time we met together and considered the confession, not last Lord's Day, but last time we met to consider this, we looked at 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verses 17 through 22. And there we saw there was in the Corinthian church, maybe not surprising because there were a lot of problems in the Corinthian church, but one of the problems here was the abuse of the Lord's Supper as they were coming together. Some were eating ahead of others. Others were becoming drunk on the wine. And so we considered that. But for our intents and purposes, for the elements at least, what that showed us is the early church, they did in fact have wine in the cup because, obviously speaking, there's no drunkenness without wine. So they had wine in the cup. So we considered that, and now we're going to move back to the Old Testament because leading into what we say the Lord's Supper, the administration of the Lord's Supper, of course, was a long history of Judaism with the Passover, and then the Lord himself with the Last Supper. All of that needs to be considered. So we're going to consider that this morning. I did, at the very end of the Sunday school class, last Sunday school class, I did have a few quotes. I just want to bring one quote back up to us as we continue, just because this will be addressed in just a moment. This is really coming from what we say Jewish oral tradition, and it's speaking of the night of the Passover. It says this: On the night of the Passover, from the close of the evening until the evening of the offering, no one was to eat until nightfall. Even the poorest person in Israel was not to eat on Passover night unless he reclined, and they were to give him no less than 4 cups of wine. Now, I just put that out because, of course, we say that there's, as that tradition holds, what they had in their possession, at least in that celebration, was wine, and we'll come back to that in just a moment. Let us then look at some Old Testament scriptures. The word, the Hebrew term for wine, I mentioned this last time, was yayin. We were getting into some of the Greek and the Hebrew, probably more Greek and Hebrew than you ever wanted to get into, but as we're looking at this. So turn to Genesis chapter 9. We're going to look at that, I said the verse, kind of the first instance of, well, the abuse of wine. So again, the Hebrew term is yayin. Genesis 9, we're going to look at verses 20 through 21. Compared to the Greek, yayin in the Hebrew would be equivalent to the oinos in the Greek related to wine. Whenever that term's used, that's the context. So Genesis 9, verses 20 through 21. Now, you know that we're preaching through Genesis, so this will be a text in front of us in the not-too-distant future. So you'll, of course, hear a lot more about this text at that point, but at least for now, let's consider this situation. So can somebody read verses 20 through 21 for me? Genesis 9, verses 20 through 21. Thank you. Yep. Nick, thank you.
And Noah began to be a farmer, and he planted a vineyard. Then he drank of the wine, and was drunk, and became uncovered in his tent.
So we see here several things, again, related to the Hebrew. The vineyard is in Hebrew kerem, and that's the reference, vineyard vine, as that term is used. And then he drank the wine, yayin, again, and of course he became drunk, and we see the subsequent action that was taken. We'll get into that more when we get to the text. But the point here is very interesting for us. Of course, here's Noah on the other side of the flood. And a vineyard, the grapes, fermented wine. Now, if we trace that through what's happened with the flood, that does give us some reference that these techniques that were being used to produce the wine, they must have come from the knowledge before the flood, right? In other words, these were this was something that was common before the flood. Through Noah and his children, his family, off the ark. Then they plant vineyards, and the wine is produced, and then, of course, the abuse takes place. The point there, wine appears very early in the text of Scripture.
One comment.
Yes.
It seems as if it's possible that Noah would have also brought grapevine along with him to plant in the new world.
Yeah. There's a lot of interesting questions here and perhaps suppositions that could be put forward. I don't think that's improper. Now, we can't say that emphatically, but of course you can cut a stalk, a root stalk like that, and you can preserve root stalks. And you know, once you're in a place where you can plant them again, they usually, and I think grapevines are very hardy. So yeah, that makes sense to me too. We don't know that emphatically, but it certainly makes sense. Yeah. Okay, just a few chapters further. Let's now look at Genesis 14. Just going to trace this through for just a bit. Genesis 14, verses 18 through 20. Can I have somebody to read 18 through 20? Genesis 14, 18 through 20. Thank you, Mike. Yep.
Then Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. He was the priest of God Most High. And he blessed him and said, Blessed be Abram of God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth. And blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand.
So here we encounter this figure, of course, Melchizedek. And whatever we say about Melchizedek, he is a type of Christ. Some have even said that this perhaps is what we call a Christophany. But let's leave it at least what we know. It's a type of Christ. It's a type of Christ. And interestingly, Melchizedek, this type of Christ, brought out bread and wine to bless Abram. And again, we don't want to press this too far, but at least of what we understand, this again, I think, is an argument that can be made that these elements, those two elements of bread and wine, are significant, are important, are to be considered. And so this figure, again, type of Christ, Melchizedek, brings the bread and the wine to bless Abram. As I'm going through this again, if there's any other thoughts, please put them forward. Sam, go ahead.
Yeah, I think it's interesting too if you think about this with the typology. I think you're drawing out the typology very well, because I think it should be seen that way. Is also the reality of this is based on deliverance, based on, you could say, a salvation.
Yeah.
And in light of that, to celebrate the salvation that has been accomplished by Abram, Melchizedek brings bread and wine. And then if you foreshadow that with Christ's great salvation, his death, his resurrection, how do we celebrate it by the bread and wine? So I think there's a lot of connections even with what the cross accomplished and what accomplished here, a temporary salvation to a greater salvation.
Yes, absolutely. Yes, good points. So thinking about those two passages in the book of Genesis, and we'll consider some more in the Old Testament as we move along, Williamson wrote or summarized this way: the same wine that intoxicated Noah, Lot, Nabal, Ahasuerus, and others was also given to Abraham by Melchizedek, was kept in houses for the kings of Israel and allowed to all the people of God. What's the point? The techniques were there. They understood what wine was. It was very prevalent. It was something that was common. The connection to Melchizedek, again, as we discussed, I think is very strong. Then wine in the Old Testament, right? There was no absolute prohibition for wine. It was typically seen as something that was drunk to merriment even. Now again, we've got to draw those lines between the prohibitions and the sins that are caused by drunkenness. And I understand that sometimes those lines are easy to cross. Of course they are. But if you think about any sin that we struggle with, any sin, those lines sometimes are very easy to cross. And so these are things that, as we're considering the elements, we've got to think about, and of course individually we've got to pray about. Let us go to Exodus chapter 12. Well, actually, I don't have the verses here, so I'll just let me summarize. For some reason, I did not write down the verses, but Exodus 12 is. Well, you can turn there. Exodus 12. I don't have the verses in context. I think just because I was going to reference the entire chapter, but I'm not going to read the entire chapter at this point. The Passover event, this would be instructions for the Passover in Exodus 12. And somebody can give me the verse number if as I'm reading this, if it becomes obvious to you, because again, I did not mention this. But related to the Passover, the instructions, interestingly, there is no command to drink wine in the Passover. The command focuses on the flesh of the lamb, unleavened bread, bitter herbs, but there's no direct command to consume wine. That is true, and that's the first of the Passover commands as we're thinking of it. Later, if we go to Exodus, you can turn to Exodus 29, verse 40. And again, this is a survey. You understanding I'm giving you a survey, correct? There's 141 instances of the word yayin in the Old Testament. We're not looking at all of those. Okay. So Exodus 29:40, this wine was offered as a drink offering, and that's what's mentioned here in verse 40. Again, I'm not reading all of the context. Later, you can look at the context in a more detailed fashion if you like. But here, verse 40, it says, "With the one lamb shall be 1/10 of an ephah of flour mixed with 1/4 of a hin of pressed oil, and 1/4 of a hin of wine as a drink offering." The interesting thing about the drink offering, though, is that it wasn't drunk. So this does require wine, but it is not to be drunk. It is to be poured out. So there we don't, again, even though wine is involved, we don't get an absolute command that it is to be drunk. And then if we move on again, we can go to various places. We're not doing an absolute survey. We get to the point that now we're kind of at the barrier or the border of the Old Testament and the New Testament. Christ is on the scene, and now we're thinking about the Passover. What was happening at the Passover? Because that's a very important question. Christ there celebrating what we call the Last Supper, a Passover event. So where does wine come into the picture? Where does wine seem to definitively come into the picture? Well, it is at some point, which I am not certain historically when I can pinpoint that point. I'm sure there are many historians that could. But it was a tradition. It was a Jewish tradition. And it seemed to come into popular observance at some point. And this popular observance would have continued until the time of Christ. And so the 4 cups of wine that was mentioned, this was a ceremony prescribed by the Mishnah. The Mishnah is the kind of a collection of Jewish oral traditions. And so there were interpretations of those traditions, the scriptures. The 4 cups then are traditionally understood to be an interpretation of Exodus 6, verses 6 through 7, which there's 4 different terms of deliverance that are employed in that particular passage. I will bring you out, as God says, deliver you, I will redeem you, and will take you to be my people. So they interpreted those as the 4 cups of wine. Now, again, we say this is tradition. We're being honest about all of this, right? This is tradition. Nevertheless, when Jesus was there at the Last Supper, and we say what was in the cup, it seems right to understand that he accepted that tradition, and what was in the cup was the wine that was offered for the Passover services. And so I think that's a logical conclusion. So if we're being honest about all of this, was wine ever explicitly commanded in the Old Testament to be drunk at the Passover? We'd have to say no to that. Was wine drunk at the Passover? We would have to say yes to that. Yes, it was. And so when the Lord took of the Passover, that celebration, he was taking wine. Let me pause there, and then I want to do a summary of both New Testament and Old Testament, some of which we just mentioned, but I just want to do a full summary. But any other thoughts or questions there? Yes.
I was talked to you about this last week, but when Brother Ralph mentioned the means by which alcoholic content is to be able to be measured in wine. The 4 cups was kind of an interesting thing to me, and it seems very simple to be able to then deduce from that if an individual knows the alcoholic content, and if, say, it's a stronger alcoholic content, and 4 cups would possibly mess up with the faculties of the mind, well then you just dilute it to be able to make sure that you can drink the 4 cups and you're still drinking wine. So
yes.
That seems very just straight up an easy argument for me for those folks at that time not having to worry about alcohol. They weren't sitting there worrying that they're going to get drunk because they knew the alcoholic content, and thus they could just pass it out to everybody diluted to whatever they needed to have it as.
And it seems like the diluting of wine with water was a common technique in the Old Testament, and even to a certain degree in the early church as well. Yes.
Brother, do you know if the cups were 4 cups per person, or were they passed and shared?
My assumption there is the passing and the sharing, but I'm not absolute. I would need to confirm that.
Okay.
Yeah, for the Old Testament Passover practice. Sam, do you know?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I would need to confirm that. I did see a hand over this direction, I believe. Yes, Frank.
While there's no explicit command to drink it, there's also no explicit command to refrain from it.
That is true. I mean, other than drunkenness. So the excess is sinful, but in consumption, yes, there's no absolute. There's not a point at which alcoholic wine is restricted altogether. Yes. Yes.
We've heard by implication or statement 2 ways to make sure you don't get drunk. The third way, of course, is just have very small cups.
Yes.
So there's plenty of ways to...
Which is moderation.
Yeah.
And moderation seems to be the point not only of the Old Testament but the New Testament. Is it's not forbidden, but it needs to be moderated. Yes. Let me then do a final summary of both New Testament, Old Testament, and then we'll move on from that point. So there's no definitive command in the Old Testament that says you must drink wine at the Passover. We just mentioned that. Nevertheless, it is very likely, if not absolute, I would say probably absolute, that wine was in the cup for the Passover, and thus wine was in the cup at the Lord's, the Last Supper. Jesus accepted that tradition. He doesn't seem to balk at that at all. He took the wine. The fruit of the vine, as we mentioned in the New Testament, in a sense that we're taking that term as, some take that term as an idiom, right? Fruit of the vine. We've discussed that. There is a little bit of wiggle room there. We're not sure at times what the wiggle room is. It's not, fruit of the vine does not seem to be used in context, although it's very rarely used in the New Testament. So we don't have a lot of comparisons, but it doesn't seem to be used as an absolute synonym for wine. Although some will make the argument that it is an idiom for wine, so we're considering all of that, right? And fruit of the vine, nevertheless, what we can say, I think, hopefully emphatically, that's the grapevine. Whatever it is coming from grapes, and so that's the fruit of the vine. The Corinthian church, as we have already seen, they were abusing wine. So let's put this in context. Before the New Testament church, right, with Christ, the Passover, wine was being celebrated at the Passover. Christ, it seems emphatically that there was wine in the cup at the Last Supper. The New Testament church, at least in Corinth, they were celebrating with wine. I think the implication is I think, very clear that wine was in the cup. So if we have those implications, what do? In other words, these are not commands, but they're strong implications. We mentioned this last time we discussed this matter as well. If we're thinking in practical matters, these are practical matters, but nevertheless, I think they hold some weight. Wine then is plentiful, even in countries that grapes don't grow very readily. They can seem to be obtained. Certainly, if they're preserved in the form of wine, because so we say it's plentiful, it's preservable, and it's portable. In other words, in a practical sense, it does, I think, make sense that the institution the Lord has given is something that is, as we say these again, plentiful, preservable, portable. Because the New Testament church is to celebrate in those matters. Okay. Let me pause there, and then I want to, again, move in the direction of this church particularly, but let me pause there first. Any last comments, questions? Because we've kind of come to the end of the Old Testament considerations at this point.
Well, just to clarify, to make clear, you were bringing in the Passover, that the Lord's Supper that Christ instituted is not the Passover. We're not observing the Passover.
Yes.
When we're doing that. So we have the Passover observed by the Jews. We see the tradition coming in. They did pick up a tradition of the 4 cups of wine. But when Christ, yes, he has the wine at the Last Supper, at the observance of the Passover, but then he institutes for the New Testament church the Lord's Supper. And so I just want to make it clear that we're not saying that because wine was not commanded in the Old Testament, that therefore we should not be using it in the New Testament. That's not what we're saying. It's a distinct and separate, it's a new commandment given by Christ to observe the Last Supper. And
yes.
What we see is that wine was present and observed during the institution of that. Does that make sense?
Yes, absolutely.
The Lord's Supper. You said the Last Supper.
The
You meant
Lord's,
Supper.
yes,
Yeah.
yes, the Lord's Supper.
I'm thinking as we go through this whole discussion, an overriding principle in Old and New Testament is moderation. And it says, be angry, but don't. There are other commands that have to do with the moderation of
Yes.
elements.
Yes, because God created us to be, we're human.
Yeah.
Now, obviously, we're sinful humans. And so many things, whether they're human emotions or things that we're partaking of, many things can easily be abused and or... So I agree. Moderation seems to be the general tone of Scripture, both Old and New Testament. Yeah, yes.
There's also another typology in the Old Testament in Proverbs 9 about wisdom, which I think wisdom there is Christ himself. I think the one who is described as wisdom, and he says, come, eat of my bread and drink of the wine I have mixed, forsake foolishness and live and go in the way of understanding. So you see another typology with Christ as wisdom saying, come eat my bread and come drink my wine.
Yes, good. Yeah, as I said, Yayin, there's so much in the Old Testament we could refer to, and there's other probably examples of typology. Yes.
Two-part question, Pastor. Do modern-day Jews still celebrate Passover, and if they do they use wine?
My answer to that is yes.
Yes and yes.
Yes and yes. I mean, any pause I have is, of course, I'm not an expert on Judaism, but I don't think any of those traditional observances have faded from the picture, no. I think they're still fully in effect. Yes.
Yeah, I just did a quick search, and yes, they still drink the 4 cups of wine.
It's kind of a stepping back a little bit, but do you know in history, it seems like when the Lord's Supper was instituted, and even in Acts, it seems that when they gathered together, even like Corinth as an example, it was more of a meal. It wasn't like a small piece of bread, a little bit of wine. They were kind of celebrating together. It seemed that, because Passover was more of a meal, and it was to be done quickly in the sense of have your full clothes on, have your sack with you, like picture of the Exodus. Mm-hmm. But it seems that when they gathered together, it wasn't kind of what we do today, is that, it's a brief sample, I guess you could say, for context. Do you know if that was a practice that early on in church history just changed due to just necessity of having more food than not, or less food than not, or is that something that maybe I am reading wrong in Acts and other places?
I'm not sure that you're reading it wrong in the early church. We're thinking about the early church and their own communion. Mm-hmm. Their communion as in coming together, not the Lord's Supper, but the Lord's Supper was a part of that fellowship.
It was extended.
Yes. So in 1 Corinthians, it seems to paint a picture where perhaps there was the meal, and then there was the celebration, and there was some the mingling of the two. There were many, because of their own selfishness and so forth. They essentially desecrated that portion of that sacred meal. Yeah. I don't know if Sam or Greg, if you want to say anything else about that. Yes.
Yeah, this has come up a lot when I was pastoring. It's a common thing that people bring up, so I've had to think a lot about it. So there's 2 things going on. You have the love feast and then you have the Lord's Supper, mm-hmm. and they're distinct. And so you did have the love feast going on, which we would kind of call a fellowship meal, but that's not to be confused with what the Lord's Supper is properly. And so it seems like at first they are using the elements of the love feast wrongly. They're getting drunk and whatnot. But those same elements, bread and wine, are then, he goes into, but what is the Lord's Supper proper? It's the broken bread, it's the wine, and that's what we're partaking about in supper proper. And so I think we do have to make a distinction between the love feast they would have and what it is when we take the Lord's Supper proper. And the Lord's Supper proper is the bread and wine, and not a full-on meal. Even though there's connections, they are distinct, and we ought to keep those things distinct.
Yeah, because I have heard that come up before, like questions of why does it sometimes seem the Lord's Supper is rushed instead of a longer period of reflection, communion together, while sharing the elements? And I've had to think through that as well, just kind of, So I was curious.
I say the traditional, obviously. There's great differences between the Roman Church and Protestant churches and how this is handled, but kind of that separation where it's that distinct unit. This is the Lord's Supper. Historically, where that separation took place, I think that's developmental over time, and I don't know. I cannot pinpoint that. I don't know when that was, but little by little over time, that became a distinct unit. And some traditions, of course, became there's a lot more pageantry that was associated with it, and you kind of go down those routes, and we would say in the end you end up with something that looked very different than the original. Yeah.
I think also too connected with this is the love feast is not directly commanded. What is commanded is 23 through 26. On the night that Jesus betrayed, he took the bread, he took the cup. And by eating and drinking the bread and the cup, we proclaim the Lord's death till he comes. And so whatever we do with the love feast, that is more an adiaphora kind of thing of indifference, where the bread and the wine are the things that are appointed by Christ.
Yeah. And another point too is Jesus almost waits to the end of the meal.
Exactly.
And he's almost
Because
done.
it's
And then he takes, sounds like a single piece of bread. He breaks that, so they would have smaller pieces anyway. He has seems like a single cup that he passes around, so even everything quantitatively becomes a lot smaller.
Exactly. Because it's a portion, very small portion of the meal.
Yeah.
And there's argument whether they divide it from that cup or drink from it, but that's a whole other issue.
That's another question.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Well, let me. I want to consider just a little while, and we'll just start this topic for our time frame, and we'll have to finish it up next time we meet together. I think we can bring paragraph 3 to a conclusion. But there is what we may call a unique history, an American history, that also should be considered here. It's not only, the issues here do not only belong to the United States, but I think in a very particular way have. So what are we referring to? Well, let me first read a quote that I read 2 weeks ago, just to set the scene. Matheson says, for the first 1800 years of the church, the use of wine in the Lord's Supper was an undisputed and uncontroversial practice. It was the universal practice of Roman Catholics, Greek Orthodox, and Protestants. It remained the universal practice for so long only because the use of wine in the descriptions of the Lord's Supper in the New Testament are so clear. There may be some slight overstatements in that quote, but nevertheless, I think the point is very valid. There seems to be less argumentation about wine versus grape juice or something other than wine for much of the church history. It just wasn't a debate like it is now. Now it's something more than what it was. It seemed to be just more accepted broadly. I'm not saying there wasn't a sect or a faction somewhere that said we're not going to use wine, we're going to use whatever freshly pressed grapes or something like that. But generally speaking, it was understood that what the Lord was speaking of was wine, and that's what would be served at the Lord's Supper. And that endured for long periods of time. So how do we arrive at where we are today? Well, again, I think in the U.S. context, we do have some kind of unique influences, and I would put those under 2 categories. Other people may put them under more categories than these. I would put them under the category of technology, and then the second of a particular social evil that started to exist. And those two we can consider. Let's consider the social evil first. That would be drunkenness. And so at the beginning of the 19th century, particularly at the beginning of the 19th century, a movement known as the moderation or abstentionist movement arose, not only here in the U.S., but parts of Europe as well. And the desire there was to break rampant alcoholism. Now, we would say that's not a bad objective. I mean, rampant alcoholism is a problem, and certainly can be. But let's continue here. That was affecting the society, and particularly, we'd say, was affecting a lot of men. And so in many churches, actually it started, I think, outside of the church and moved into the church. There were different societies that were formed. Many of these societies were formed and originally led by women who saw these rampant issues that were affecting men in the culture, drunkenness, and wanted to really come up with a solution to the problem. And so, what's the problem? There are many people that are drunk, many people that are abusing alcohol. So that's what we'll attack. The element itself, does it make sense? Alcohol itself. And so many attempts were made to try to remove that, at least limit it in its production, limit it in its purchase, and of course with the goal that if we can eliminate alcohol altogether, or at least in moderation, it's not as plentiful as it is, then drunkenness would also cease. Because many that were part of these societies and initiatives were also Christians. They were also Christians. The church, of course, saw that as something that we can adopt and push forward as our own agenda. That's something that we can help with. That's something that we can come alongside of. Unfortunately, over time, what happened, of course, that became solidified with a certain we might say holiness as it relates to the church. In other words, over time, churches were seen then to be initiators of this movement. Alcoholism is the problem, and if alcohol is the problem, then the elimination of it is the solution. And churches were affected by that too. And so you get to the point where, for lack of better terminology, a sort of self-righteousness starts to creep in. Churches that had wine that they served still at the Lord's Supper, well, that was seen as now a perverse thing. Remember, the Lord instituted. The Passover, at least, the Last Supper was wine. In other words, the question is, if alcohol itself is that perverse thing, and alcohol is being served at the Lord's Supper, do you see a problem that starts to develop in people's minds? This is, and then you think about Jesus. Did he have wine in the cup? Matheson again kind of summarizes the issue here. If the use of alcohol is sinful, and if Jesus never sinned, then Jesus could not have used an alcoholic beverage such as wine in the Lord's Supper. He must have used some other beverage, and it was argued that grape juice was also the fruit of the vine. Gradually, churches that had adopted the gospel of abstinence changed the elements of the sacrament and substituted grape juice for wine. So you can. I'm just putting forth a trajectory. I'm not claiming that I know all of everything that happened, because it's a very involved issue and process, and there's a lot of history here. But you can see the trajectory of what was happening. And so eventually, it was seen as any church that had wine, they're part of the problem, right? That should not be done. And so this kind of issues of self-righteousness started to creep in.
Well, that's based on a law, civil law. The idea of alcohol being bad or dangerous, it was illegal after a period of time.
Well, these pushes, the societies and the promotions, and of course the backing of many churches as well, had the ultimate effect of affecting legislation. Yes,
but,
yeah.
I mean, that's like the culture we live in today. Culture infiltrating the church is not the same thing as the church.
Yes. Yeah, so we'll say these were, right, societal pressures, cultural pressures. We don't want to act as if, as a church, that alcoholism is not a problem. It is a major problem, and does need to be addressed. The question is simply, is the removal of that element, alcohol altogether, is that the solution to the problem, or is it an issue of the heart? That's the question. Yeah.
If I could make a quick analogy,
Yes.
something that's coming to mind a lot with everything that you just said about that process. I'm thinking about the purity culture movement of the 90s and early 2000s. There are a lot of similarities with, here's the problem, well, we should just teach all these young Christian men and women that sexuality is something that should just be suppressed completely, and it really shifted the mentality, I think,
Your
about.
identity
Right,
becomes your
yeah,
identity.
it becomes your identity. So I'm seeing some comparisons with how it was handled wrongly, I think.
Proper biblical teaching is always the solution. Yes.
It's like,
Yeah.
it's many things in our society, like guns, okay, aren't evil. People are evil. The heart of man is evil. The wine is not evil. The heart of man is evil. The internet is not evil, but it can be used, and the heart of man is evil. We can go down the list over and over and over again, but we have to be careful about taking something that God has not said is evil and calling it evil, then imposing it upon the church. When any other thing, and COVID might be a good example of this, when you have political pressure or cultural pressure to change something in the church, and they say stop meeting, church, stop meeting, we should absolutely reject any cultural or political pressure that would cause us to change something that God has commanded us to do. We need to reject that outright. And so what we saw with the onset of Welch's grape juice is that we had cultural and political pressure being pushed on the church, and the churches in mass acquiesced to something and called something evil that God never said was evil. And so this is a dangerous path, and something that we need to consider in light of this whole conversation.
So Greg mentioned something, and I know that we need to conclude here in just a moment, so this will not be long. Welch's. So that gets into the technology issue new technologies came about. Thomas B. Welch, a dentist and minister of the Methodist Church, invented a grape pasteurization process that kept grapes from fermenting. So that new technology also added into the picture, right? We have these methods now that can disallow, right, the normal natural biological processes, bacterial or fungal processes that would convert the sugars to alcohol. So that technology was also coming into play. We're not against technologies, of course, but this you see what's all kind of coming together at that time, where you've got rampant abuse, you got technologies, you got now the ability to keep freshly pressed grapes from fermenting, and that then becomes kind of a cultural, societal initiative to eliminate the use of, and particularly I say that eliminate the use of wine in the churches. This is a particularly American thing, but it's not just. I tell you, when I was in Thailand, I didn't question this much because I came from churches, of course, that in the background they always use grape juice. I didn't really think about it. When I was in Thailand, the churches there, they used grape juice. I really didn't think about it. And then I really got to think about it. There's a friend that I have in Thailand who is really a historian of Thai church history. And I asked him recently, because I wanted to know, like, have Thai churches always used grape juice? And he said yes. He said because there's two things. American missionaries brought it over at that point. And secondly, there is in the Thai culture a very strong stigma with alcoholism, kind of like it is here. So those two things came together also in Thailand to produce basically the same effect. He said basically there's no church. It's hard to find a church in Thailand that would actually serve wine at the Lord's Supper.
No, the American missionaries are the ones that propagated this outside the U.S. Almost exclusively. So where it was being used, again, to our point, historically, it was brought in by missionaries when they planted churches and did missions.
Okay, we necessarily need to stop there, but there's a little bit more there, just to conclude, and then we want to conclude, broadly speaking, on paragraph 3, as we've been discussing it for this particular church, and then after that we will move on to the other paragraphs in succession. Okay, let us pray.